us through all of this rumours and predictions ahead of the budget, which is now in less than a fortnight. Well, let us unpack a bit more about the budget with my guests for the next half an hour or so. We have three of the think tank world's finest brains joining us. Torrin Wilkins is the founder and director of Centre Think Tank, which, as its name suggests, is a centrist think tank. Nice to see you doing exactly what you say on the tin. Emma Revel is the external affairs director at the Centre for Policy Studies. That is a centre-right think tank. And Danny Sri Skandaraja, sorry, Danny, for stumbling over your surname, is the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation. Very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. Danny, maybe we can start with you because you're not here in the studio with us. Do you want to just define what you do in a think tank for people who are listening and maybe don't know exactly what that means?
What I do, but a think tank, a really good one, takes sort of the big problems of the day, the policy challenges that politicians and others are grappling with. And what we do is we collect the evidence, talk to people who are, who have lived experience of those issues, and we try to come up with policy solutions that will, make society better, fairer, more sustainable, and all of that. And so, it's one of the wonderful things about British democracy is we've got this sort of space for vibrant, debate amongst folk like us.
How much input are you guys having into the budget discussions? Because, obviously this is a decisions making to the Treasury, but how far in advance does your papers, do your ideas feed into the Treasury's thinking, Emma?
I think it depends on the different think tanks. Some take a really long-term approach and are not actually focused on feeding into individual budgets. They're more about changing the narrative, changing the sort of what is tolerable to public opinion. So actually it's not about the day-to-day political events. It's more about, bigger picture things. I mean, from our perspective, we're a centre-right think tank. We were founded by Margaret Thatcher and it's our 50th anniversary this year. So in terms of feeding into Labour's first budget, that's not necessarily something we're going to be doing directly. But, in previous years, you are thinking, months or even years in advance. And the last budget in March, when Jeremy Hunt stood up and announced that he was going to be making full expensing permanent, he actually credited the CPS as one of the organisations who'd been providing the evidence that actually this was a really good thing to do in terms of, incentivising investment. So, you can have a really specific effect.
OK, well, let us talk about the budget. I just want to play you a little clip off the Energy Secretary Ed Miliband, because we've been discussing about cabinet ministers who've been voicing their concerns about what potentially they're going to be facing. Let's have a listen to Energy Secretary Ed Miliband.
I think we've got a very difficult fiscal situation that we've inherited from the last government. But the determination of this government, of Rachel Reeves, is to ensure fiscal stability, but also ensure we invest in the future. That's why she made the commitment, a big commitment for a Chancellor to make on carbon capture and storage, and ensure that the choices she makes are fair. And I think that's what you'll see in the budget later this month.
But big cuts are to come.
No, I'm absolutely not saying that. There are difficult decisions to be made, and she will set those out. But I know that she is determined to make big investments in the future and to ensure fair choices.
OK, absolutely not to big cuts, but yes to difficult decisions and yes to fair choices. Torrin, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's the political tightrope, isn't it? Trying to work out how to say that there might be cuts ahead, but they won't be large. I mean, you saw the same kind of thing with capital gains. OK, I'm going to deny what the number is, which I think was about 39%. And then we're going to go back and we're going to say, oh, well, there may need to be some wriggle room on this. We may need to do something. So I think part of it is the political challenge if you come into office as a party of the left, then finding that you might have to make some choices that might seem a bit more familiar to parties of the right, because the economic situation is difficult, the public service situation is difficult. It's not just spending cuts over a few years. You've got this cumulative problem where you've got basically decades of slight underinvestment. And when you look at the challenges that public services face, whether it's an ageing population for healthcare or more rail travellers on the train lines, you really have to come down to this point where Labour needs to make a decision, and it also needs to understand how big is the issue. You know, we've heard figures of 20 billion, we've heard figures of 40 billion now, so it's understanding what is the scale and what are they willing to do. Is this going to be tax rises? Is it going to be departmental budget? So I think part of this is just learning, OK, what is the scale and how do we fix it? And they've got a lot of work to do on that.
Danny, I mean, that is an interesting point, isn't it? Because we're very accustomed to expectation management in the lead up to a budget. And we also become accustomed to these various figures floating around, fiscal headroom, all of this. We've heard of the 22 billion black hole. But, you know, Torrin is right. It's now expanded to a £40 billion funding gap. Do you think that's confusing? I mean, where is that leaving people in terms of what to expect from a fortnight's time?
Yeah, look, there certainly have been lots of different numbers bandied around, but I think the truth of the matter, and you said it just now, is that, you know, all politicians have to make tough choices. It feels like this generation of government ministers have a really tough set of choices to make. My worry when it comes to these sorts of numbers is that it's almost like the government's tying both of its hands when it comes to making those choices. You know, on one hand is tied by the so-called fiscal rules. You know, let's not forget, these are arbitrary, relatively recent rules around government borrowing. I think that they're outdated. I think the government could be much more nuanced and sensible about how it determines where and what for it can borrow. So that's one hand that's tied behind their back. The other is that they've ruled out a bunch of these tax rises and don't seem prepared to go for, you know, real increases in, for example, wealth taxes or capital gains taxes, as Torrin's just said. So it's almost like we've got the number issue of working out, well, you know, what exactly is the size of the gap. But then there's a more fundamental issue, which is, you know, how do they even give themselves the room, if you will, to make the investments that our public services so desperately need, that they will need to make if they've got any chance of winning the next election, for example.
OK, I can tell you, Danny, that there are lots of nodding going on in agreement to what you were saying in the studio, just because you can't see them. I mean, Emma, you agree with what Danny said?
Yeah, I agree with some of what was said. I think, you know, there are going to be incredibly difficult choices that need to be made. I think one of the challenges that Labour will face is that, you know, we were saying before, the idea of 20% departmental cuts appears to have just come out of nowhere. This is something that's sort of appeared in the last week or so. Obviously, the conversations behind the scenes have been going on for much longer, but the public will be looking at this if that is the level of cuts that Rachel Reeves is expected to announce in a few weeks, and thinking, well, where has this come from? Why is this happening?
And if that's not austerity, then what is?
Well, quite. I think they're going to certainly feel like that is what's happening. And I think one of the problems is that politicians on all sides, it's not a Labour or a Conservative issue necessarily, are not willing or not able to have big conversations with the public about the state of the public finances, about the cost of public spending. You know, from a centre-right free market perspective, you know, it's not enough, or it's not sufficient to talk about tax cuts or trying to cut the size of government budgets, because what that leads to is trying to do the same amount of work, that deliver the same amount of programmes with just less money. Now, efficiencies can be made and should be made, absolutely. But I think we also need to have a conversation about, well, what is the government's responsibility and what actually shouldn't be the government's responsibility? I think with, you know, the pandemic, for example, we had a massive expansion in what the government is expected to do. And I think some politicians do need to stand up and say to the public, look, at the end of the day, the government, the state, cannot and should not do everything that it is currently doing. Some of these things need to be re-delivered to the private sector, the charity sector, the third sector, because this isn't the government's job, and we can't afford to keep doing every single thing that we've told you that we will do.
Well, it appears today that some cabinet ministers, the very ones in charge of departments, are expressing unease about potentially what is coming down the track and potentially having to row back from things that they would like to provide, and have written directly to the Treasury and the Prime Minister. Let's have a listen to the Education Secretary talking to the BBC, Bridget Phillipson. She refused to say whether she was among those who'd written with their concerns to the Treasury.
I'm determined to deliver a better deal for children and learners and young people right across our country. There are lots of conversations happening right now across government between the Chancellor with members of the Cabinet, as you would expect, in the usual way as part of the budget process.
Torrin, I mean, Do you think there's an interesting thing happening here, which is that the previous shadow cabinet, now cabinet, they all ended up pretty much in their departments that they had been shadowing. And they had been used to basically working together in this very kind of collegiate way in opposition to a Tory government that was clearly on its way out. Now, here they are competing against each other, basically for money, and having to individually make their case to Rachel Reeves, who was until very recently just a colleague on the same level as them. Now here they are competing against different departments and having to go. There's something about that dynamic, perhaps, that is playing into this.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that question, if you were a cabinet minister running a department, would you slash its budget? And the answer is probably not. It's far easier to do that if you're the Chancellor and purely looking at the economic situation. So it is a real difference, I think, between opposition working together, and you all sort of have this goal of let's get into government. And the problem is, especially under the voting system we have, where effectively your one goal is to get into power, and when you are in power, you're not having to sort of make trade-offs with coalition partners. You're effectively having to make trade-offs with yourself, with your own ministers, who their jobs, their success of their jobs is reliant on them getting extra money from the government, is getting funding, is whether it's the NHS and falling waiting times. If that doesn't happen, then your department won't be considered a success. And that all relies on convincing the Chancellor, who is purely looking at, let's get the economy moving, let's sort out the public finances. And I think that's also somewhat the ideological struggle within Labour now, is that difference between, are we a centre-left party? Are we focusing a lot on spending on public services? Or are we focusing on the economy and how to marry those two things together? And as a centrist, I can say it's difficult at the beginning, but you'll get there eventually. It is totally possible. It's totally possible to be a party that on the one hand invests in public services, but on the other also supports businesses, also looks at ways to simplify regulations, support small businesses, simplify the tax system. It is possible to do both. I think the challenge now is they're slowly on that road to trying to work out how to do both at the same time. I think the issue will be that if you want to grow the economy, it comes down to that thing, every person who goes through the NHS is a worker. Every person who goes through the education system will become a worker. And if you want your sort of healthy, educated workforce, then you desperately need good public services. So if you want to marry those two, it's difficult, but it's that lesson that Labour currently is trying to learn.
Danny, we had a lot of talk, haven't we, about this gap between when Labour took power and delivering their first budget, perhaps being a bit too long, have allowed all this space for, all these conversations to arise. Does it all feel a bit last minute to you, or do you think this is quite typical wrangling in the kind of days leading up to the budget? Because Rachel Reeves has had a long time to prepare, hasn't she?
Yeah, but it certainly is very typical that, ministers complain about Treasury rules and limits on their spending. But yeah, perhaps what is surprising is that, there's this level of discontent so early in this government's tenure. And despite Rachel Reeves giving herself, I think rightly, some time to get into government before delivering her budget, I think that was pretty sensible. But it goes back to something I think, Torrin and Emma have both said, which is there are some big issues that need to be resolved. For example, what is the size and shape of public services that this country wants or deserves, and how do we pay for it? And, so we could spend a lot of time talking about the 20 billion here or 20 billion there, but let's play forward a little bit. And if we want any chance of having high quality public services, fit for purpose in 2030, 2040, 2050, then we need a fundamental rethink about how public finances work. If you look at the latest OBR forecasts for the next few decades, that gap is only going to get bigger unless we have a fundamental realignment of, how we collect public revenue, from what sources. And that is a conversation very few politicians seem, willing or prepared to have.
Emma, just before we go to the news, can I just take you back to a point that Danny made earlier, which was about the fiscal rules and this talk about Rachel Reeves potentially changing some of them. She had them in place, as the previous government did, essentially as a signal of credibility. And what does it tell us now that she's considering changing them, that essentially she's done the job to reassure the markets, to reassure voters that she is a safe pair of hands when it comes to the economy. So she can afford to tweak one of them about borrowing to basically give her a bit more room and a bit more money to play with.
I think it tells us that she feels like she needs to. She feels like she needs that headroom. It cannot just be all doom and gloom. She does need to give something positive to the markets and also to the country. Otherwise, this budget is going to go, down incredibly poorly with the way it's received by the public. I think as well, the point has already been made. These fiscal rules are chopped and changed quite often. It's not the case that we have a golden set of fiscal rules that every chancellor has abided by for the last 5 decades. Every government decides to tweak them at some point. I think what's interesting is going into an election and a manifesto and saying, no, we won't change the government's fiscal rules, and then changing them effectively almost immediately.
OK. Emma, Torrin, Danny, stay with us. We will be back with you shortly. Good afternoon. Leila Nathoo here in for Matt Chorley while he is in the States. We have been talking to some of the think tank world's finest minds this afternoon to chew over the issues of the day. I'm pleased to say they are still with me. Haven't made for the exit just yet, which is good. Torrin Wilkins, the founder and director of Centre Think Tank, which, as its name suggests, a centrist think tank, for all those who missed the description earlier. Emma Revel, the external affairs director at the Centre for Policy Studies Centre Right think tank. And Danny Sri Skandaraja is the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation, a left-leaning think tank, shall we say. Thank you, all three of you, for sticking around. I just wanted to take you into the world of the Tory leadership contest very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, because we've had quite an interesting intervention, shall we say, from one Tory MP who has told ITV that one of the candidates, Kemi Badenoch, remember it's Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, who are now down to the final two, going to be going to the members for their say. One Tory MP, Christopher Chope, has said Kemi Badenoch is preoccupied with her own children and says you can't spend all of your time with your family while being leader of the opposition. He said that he's backing Robert Jenrick in the contest, whose children are a bit older. Let's have a listen to what Sir Christopher Chope said to ITV.
As much as I like Kemi, I think she's preoccupied with her own children, quite understandably. But I think Robert's children are a bit older, and I think that it's important that whoever leads the opposition has got an immense amount of time and energy.
Sorry, Christopher, can I just clarify that? You're saying that a woman shouldn't be standing to be leader of a political party because she's got young kids?
I'm not saying that at all. I was one of Margaret Thatcher's strongest and staunchest supporters.
What's giving you that concern, though?
Well, what gives me the concern is because I understand from talking to colleagues that Kemi spends a lot of time with her family, which I don't resent at all. But the consequence of it is that you can't spend all your time with your family as at the same time being leader of the opposition. And you could argue that Margaret Thatcher's family suffered as a result of the commitment and dedication which she gave to leading our country. It's perfectly fair. It's a perfectly fair point, and where you're not involved, you haven't got a vote in this procedure. It's a perfectly fair point, and if you're looking forward to Kemi becoming Prime Minister, that's great. I don't resent you saying that.
Well, Sir Christopher Chope there talking to ITV. He's a Tory MP and he was speaking to a panel show on ITV about Kemi Badenoch's suitability for the Tory leadership contest. Did you feel strongly about what you heard? Get in touch with us. Text us 85058. WhatsApp or call us 08085 909 693. And you can email Matt's programme email address, just Chorley at bbc.co.uk. Emma, does this belong in the 2024 Conservative leadership contest, this sort of opinion?
Not really. I don't think it belonged in the previous leadership contest between Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May, where a similar comment from the candidate themselves, really knocked Andrea's campaign off track. It's perfectly reasonable to point out Robert Jenrick has children, Keir Starmer has children, David Cameron, had children, Tony Blair had children while he was Prime Minister. This is not an accusation that is ever levelled against men in politics. No one says that male politicians spend too much time with their kids. You can have a conversation about the impact of a political career on family life in a balanced way, but I don't think what Chris Chope said is in any way appropriate.
Torrin, seems a bit of a kind of I mean, what was he thinking there? And then tried to sort of row back in that clip, didn't he? So I'm not saying that at all, that she's not suitable, but I don't know what else he could have meant.
Yeah, and I mean, by the time he said it, it had come out. So, I mean, it is part of the wider culture problem that we have in politics generally. We have this real issue, whether it is getting women in politics, whether it's getting people from ethnic minorities involved in politics. At the moment, we just do really badly on it. And that means that these kind of comments come up from time to time. And I mean, if you think about why these issues occur, why we end up with people not only with those kind of views in politics, because you kind of expect it to some extent that some people have views that are not just disagreeable, but of those kind of extents. But I mean, been running a programme called For a Better Politics for a long time, looking at why do we have these kind of problems in politics? Why do people not get into politics when they have kids, for instance? Why do we not treat complaints in political parties properly? Why do we have such bad selection procedures that vary so much between... So you've got all of these issues, and I feel like it's just that problem once again rearing its ugly head of the issues that we have in the political system. And unfortunately, they're not going to get solved until we really look underneath why our system works like it does, why people like Christopher Chope end up as MPs. I mean, it isn't really acceptable in this day and age. And again, I think it just points to that wider political problem that I've been talking about for years, but I think genuinely needs to change.
Danny, do you think it shows that this leadership contest is getting nasty?
Well, yes, perhaps. I mean, to me, it shows, as Emma said, there's a sort of, there's high levels of misogyny in all parts of society, including in politics, including in this particular leadership race. It's certainly the case that, we have some really sort of unfair expectations on our politicians, and it's hard. I know lots of people who've chosen not to enter politics for all those reasons that Torrin's just talked about. But there's also something else, which is the double whammy in this, is that we're also experiencing sort of historically low levels of trust in our politicians and our elected officials. One survey last year found that only 7% of us think that our elected officials are acting in the interests of the country, and 2/3 of them, or 2/3 of us, think that they are acting in their own interests. So there is something that dramatic or radical needs to be done to fix trust in politics. And again, I'm not sure that the current leadership across all of these parties is willing to have that conversation.
It's awful, isn't it, how sort of damaging a throwaway comment can actually be, and just, the kind of impression that it paints of politicians in Westminster as well for those looking in, showing that it's perhaps still stuck in a different era. Anyway, that was the latest development in the ongoing Tory leadership contest. We've still got a few weeks to run. Start of November, the winner will be announced after voting by Tory party members. I want to turn to a different topic now with you three while we have you, because there was quite an interesting study published by the Refugee Council today about the government's asylum policy. And this is, it was an area that was very closely associated with the previous Conservative government and their promise to stop the boats. Obviously didn't have much luck in doing that. Labour had spent ages attacking it, talking about, the Rwanda scheme. One of the first acts they did was say, no, we're getting rid of the Rwanda scheme. We're putting in this border security command, and we're going to basically speed up the asylum system and process all the arrivals, crack down on the organised crime gangs to stop people coming over in boats across the channel in the first place. And it's quite interesting to sort of think about, the first 100 days, actually. This has been still a big problem for the Labour Party. They've got lots of boats coming, numbers are increasing. There have been thousands of people coming over the summer. Their border security demand is kind of getting up and running. They've had to ask for more hotel space this week because there are still people who need to be housed. They have restarted the asylum system when previously new arrivals couldn't be processed in the asylum system. They were just banned from claiming asylum at all or being even considered. So now the Refugee Council says that, look, because Labour has opened up this system again, 62,000 people could actually end up being granted asylum in the UK as the government attempts to kind of move through this backlogs. And it's talking about the hundreds of thousands of cases that are actually still there. Emma, I mean, what do you make of Labour's strategy on this very crucial issue, which, as I said, sort of tended to be the last government's Achilles heel. But actually, Labour have inherited this problem and at the moment don't really seem to be making much progress.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've inherited this problem. I think the main decision that was made was to scrap Rwanda. They did it almost immediately, as they said they would. And, you know, you can agree or disagree on the merits of the Rwanda scheme. Labour clearly don't want to go down that route. Personally, I think that's the choice they're allowed to make. But they need to also come up with an alternative, because the numbers, you know, crossing the channel are continuing to tick up, as they always would have done over the summer when the weather was better. The public are never going to be happy about any level of boat crossings in the channel, and they're concerned about immigration on a much bigger scale. Actually, legal migration is of equal, if not more, concern to the public, given the scale of net migration we've seen over the last, you know, couple of decades. I think if you ask the public, what do you think Labour's plans are, they would either not be able to give you a clear answer, or they would give you an answer but say, we're not happy with that. That's not meeting, you know, that's not what we want the attitude to migration to be. I think it's interesting how little it's come up for Labour so far. They've sort of managed to downplay the fact that they've scrapped Rwanda with no alternative and don't seem to have a coherent plan. But it is going to bubble along because, you know, it's a never-ending problem. Something needs to be done. We need to have a more rigorous plan for how we tackle legal and illegal migration to this country.
Danny, do you think that Labour's plan to tackle the gangs and try and go to the kind of source of this problem is a workable one?
Yes, absolutely. Because, you know, gimmicks like Rwanda were never going to work, you know, made sort of thumbed our nose at international obligations that we have to people fleeing war and persecution and seeking a safer home. So I think they're exactly right to sort of move beyond sort of gimmicks and try to tackle the root of the problem. That will necessarily take time. It will involve working with all sorts of other countries along the way. But, you know, the Refugee Council also has a really important point, which is, you know, dealing with spontaneous arrivals is one thing. What we then do with processing is arguably an even more important thing. And that's, you know, something we rarely have talked about in recent years. The cost of the backlog, the cost of the inefficiencies in the asylum processing system have cost us billions of pounds a year in recent years of putting people up in hotels. It's precious public money. It's the sort of money that Rachel Reeves wants to find. And so it really is important that we do something quickly about sorting out, you know, the processing of people once they're here, and make it much more efficient as well as humane.
Torrin, I mean, the issue of asylum accommodation is a massive one, isn't it? I mean, the hotel bill is really a big dent in the Home Office budget. But it doesn't look like the government has any answers. They've scrapped the large sites, those military bases, the former military bases that the previous government wanted to use to avoid hotels popping up across the country. So they haven't got that. Meanwhile, they've had to ask hotels now to increase capacity. I mean, are they doing the sticking plaster approach, which they've been all along trying to say they're trying to avoid?
Yeah, it's difficult to see that they're not, and I think this is because there are so many issues compiled into one thing, which is having a huge number of refugees who want to come to the UK, and actually within that you have that we don't allow asylum seekers to work while they're in the UK. So effectively we say, OK, you're going to be on a small amount of money per week, we're going to find you accommodation, and you're not allowed to work. So a lot of them get stuck in this situation. I've spoken to quite a few people who were, thankfully, a lot of them have actually managed to get through the system, which is as difficult as it is. But they are in this situation where they're having to take state handouts, take state support, but they're not allowed to work. So they effectively get stuck in this limbo system and then blamed for being stuck in a limbo that they had no choice over. And I think there's plenty of things the government can do. Obviously, one of them is allow them to work when they're in the UK, and that would have huge economic boosts as well. I also think trying to get asylum claims sorted as early on in the process. At the moment, we're waiting for them to arrive at the UK, so you have this real problem where, of course, people are going to cross over because they know that's a way to get their asylum claim dealt with. So rather than trying to then field the problem further out, send people to different countries and so forth, I think the sensible solution is to try and look at how do we make sure that people can apply as early on as possible? How can we tackle the current backlog? So it's a whole host of issues that are kind of neatly wrapped up in this really simple, we have too many people coming who are asylum seekers. But again, we've got so many conflicts in the world at the moment that we genuinely need to have a plan, And that comes in a lot of forms, and I think that's why it's going to take Labour a long time on this.
Danny, did I hear you trying to briefly come in?
Yeah, I think look, Torrin's point about asylum seekers not being allowed to work, it was 20 odd years ago that the then Labour government stopped asylum seekers from working on the belief that it would deter people from coming to the UK or trying to come to the UK. Many of us argued at the time it was nonsensical, it was inhumane, and ultimately it would cost us as a society, because we'd be sitting there with some of the brightest, bravest people in the world not being allowed to work and instead relying on handouts from the state. And it's that sort of false sort of assumptions that migration policy has been built on over recent decades, and we need politicians to be brave and say, look, if you're here and you're seeking protection, we'll give you the right to work, we'll try to process your claim as quickly as we can, and we'll do the right thing, rather than create these sorts of policies that just cost us all in the long term.
OK, Danny, many thanks. We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, with you three. Torrin Wilkins, thanks so much, from the Centre think tank. Emma Revel from the Centre for Policy Studies, and Danny Sri Skandaraja from the New Economics Foundation. Thank you so much for coming in and discussing all of that with us. It's going to be really interesting, I think, to see where the new Labour government ends up on their asylum policy.